Chapter 29 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. A woman's scream. The black cloud of death. We stood there at the casement of the palace, gazing with a growing terror at the visible evidence of the tragedy which threatened. A black cloud off there in the distance, spreading out, rolling inexorably toward us. And then came the wind, and with it a breath of the black monster, a choking, horrible suggestion of the death rolling already over the city. We must have been fascinated at the casement for some considerable time. Elza's thought messages had ceased. Abruptly I came to myself. The black cloud of death! I turned to Georg and Maida. "Alarm the city! Arouse them all! Alarm!" Maida's face was white. She flung off Georg's arm, which had been protectingly around her. "The siren!" Terrible moments, those that followed. Confusion, panic, death. The public siren in the tower by the lagoon entrance shrilled its warning. The danger lights blazed out. The city came to life. Lights sprang up everywhere. People, with the daze of sleep still upon them, appeared at the casements, on the rooftops, on the canal steps. They appeared, fumbling with their boats. Panic. A pandemonium. Aircraft, such as could so hastily be mustered, swept overhead. A glare of lights everywhere. The shrill voice of the siren stilled, to make audible the broadcast warnings. Stentorian tones screaming. The black cloud of death. Escape from the city. Escape to Industriana. Warning, advice, command. But over it all, the breath of the black cloud now lay heavy. The lights were dimmed by it. Everywhere, to every deepest recess of the city, to every inner room where to escape it many had fled, its deadly choking breath was penetrating. Within the palace was turmoil. We had an air vehicle on a landing stage nearby, but Georg and Maida would not leave at once. Rulers of the Central State, as a director might stick to his crumbling tower, they stayed now in the great city, encouraging the people, Maida's voice futilely attempting to broadcast over the uproar. Georg commanding the official air vessels to load with refugees, himself struggling to direct the jam of boats toward the embarking stages. We were in the instrument room of the palace. The air was pale blue, though I had closed every casement. Ourselves, choking already, then gasping, and with no time or thought to procure a mask. The chemical room, from whence we might have secured apparatus to purify our air, had been abandoned before we thought to seek it out. I dashed into it, my breath held. Its casements were open. Its air thick blue with the fumes. Its staff long since fled. I ran back to Georg and Maida, gasping, my lungs on fire, my head roaring. "No use! Abandoned!" The Department of Weather Control, where, had we been forewarned, we might have found means to divert the wind by another of our own creation, was deserted by its staff at the first alarm. "No use! Georg! Maida! Let us go!" The mirrors all about us in the instrument room were going dark. The horrible scenes of death throughout the city which they pictured were vanishing. The public lights were going out. The broadcast voices were ceasing. The city now was out of control. But still the lagoon outside was packed with boats, overloaded boats. Screams of terror, choked into silence. Boats with frenzied occupants leaping into the water to find a quicker, happier death. A woman with a babe in her arms on a housetop across the lagoon. The infant already dead. The crazed mother flinging it down into the water, herself following with a long, gasping scream. At last Georg pulled at me. No longer could we speak. Pulled at me, and with Maida between us, we fled. The air outside was worse. In the dimness, our landing stage seemed belans away. The flagged area between us and the stage. A space of square-cut metal flagging bordering the lagoon was littered with bodies, dead or dying. People even now, staggering from landed boats, staggering blindly, stumbling over bodies, falling and lying always where they had fallen. With our own senses fading, we groped our way forward. Soon we were separated. I saw Maida fall and Georg pick her up, but I was powerless to reach them. The landing stage seemed so far away. The dead and dying beneath my feet obstructed me as I staggered over them. A woman, reeling toward me, flung her arms about my neck with an iron grip of despair. I stared into her face, purple almost with its congested blood, her mouth gaping, her bloodshot eyes bulging, and even with the terror distorting them, I saw beneath it their look of despairing appeal. Her arms clinging to me desperately, but with a curse I flung her to the ground and reeled onward. Without knowing it, I had come to the brink of the water's edge. The flagging seemed to drop away. I fell. Dimly, I heard the splash as I struck the water, and felt a grateful cooling sense as it closed over me. I am a strong, instinctive swimmer. I did not breathe, and when I rose to the surface, the single swift breath I took was purer than any I had had for half an hour past. My head cleared a little. Swimming instinctively, and with cautious breaths, I found that I was able to go on. I know now that by some vagary of chance, of fate if you will, I had struck a surface area where breathable air still remained. I swam, striving to plan, to think where I might be swimming, yet it was all a phantasmagoria with only the strength of my muscles and the instinct to preserve my life remaining to direct me. Swimming endlessly, swimming, taking a half gasp of breath, swimming, trying to think, or dreaming. Was it all a dream? When I came to myself, I was lying upon a bank of ferns in the outskirts of the city. It was still night. The black cloud of death had passed on. The air was pure. Like a man for days bereft of water, I lay and drank in the air, pure at last, as the Almighty distills it for us. Bodies were lying beside me on the bank. A dark, silent house stood nearby, and a deserted boat. All darkness and silence, the brooding silence of death. I was still dazed. Maida, Georg, they seemed like people in a dream long faded. Industriana. They were going to the Real city of Industriana. I had been trying to get there. I must get there now, join them. I climbed to my feet. The edge of a forest was nearby, and with wavering steps I started toward it. Looking back on it now, I realized that I was even then half crazed. In a daze, I must have stumbled through the forest for hours, unreasoning, with only that one idea, to get to Industriana, and in the background of my consciousness, the vague belief that Elza would be there to greet me. Into the depths of the untrammeled forest, with unguided steps, I wandered. At last I found myself wondering if the dawn were coming. The tri-night hour was long since past. The auroral lights, as I could sometimes see them through the tangle of vegetation overhead, were low in the sky. Insects, sometimes larger beings, leaped and slithered unseen before my advance, but I did not heed them. Eyes may have peered at me as I stumbled through the blackness of the undergrowth, but if they did, I did not notice them. And then at last I was brought abruptly to full rationality and consciousness. Stumbling through a tangle of low growth, a black thicket which tore at my garments and scratched my flesh, I was transfixed by a woman's scream. It came through the darkness from near at hand. A crashing of the underbrush and a woman's scream of terror. It stopped my breath turned me cold. Elza! End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. The Monster. I stood frozen with horror, but as my brain cleared, awake at last to full rationality and consciousness, beneath the horror came a surging joy of the knowledge that at last Elza was near me. The scream was repeated. Inactive no longer, I dashed the thicket branches apart with my arms and plunged forward through the darkness. Ahead of me, the thickets opened into a sort of clearing. I saw the sky, the stars, paling stars, with the first flush of dawn overpowering them. I stood at the edge of an open space in the dim, flat gray illumination of morning twilight. Elza! She was there, standing near a huge isolated tree. Elza, pale, trembling, a hand pressed against her mouth in terror, disheveled, her garments dirty and torn with her wanderings through the forest. A swift glimpse as momentarily I paused. A second or two only, but the scene was impressed upon my brain as actinic light upon a photo screen. Close by Elza, partially behind her, I saw something small, no taller than Elza's waist, a naked thing of sleek, glistening skin, the monstrosity of a human child. A bulging head, wavering upon a neck incapable of supporting it, a thick round body, twisted, misshapen limbs, a face. Human? It made my gorge rise with its gruesome suggestion of humanity. Nostrils, no nose. A mouth, lipless but red like a curved gash with upturned corners to make the travesty of a grin. A triangle of watery eyes, goggling. Senselessly, it stood watching Elza with a dull, vacant curiosity. Not human, this thing, yet monstrously repulsive in its hideous suggestion of an idiot child. Elza was not facing it. My gaze instinctively followed hers to the tree. Crowning horror! The adult of this thing upon the ground hung swaying by a thick hand and arm from a low limb. Hung, then dropped. Growling, mouthing as though it would try and form human words of menace, it picked itself up and shambled toward Elza. I leaped for them. Elza seemed too terrified to run. The thing reached her, towered over her, seized her in its arms. She screamed, the agony of revolt and terror, but over her voice rose my own shout of rage, and abruptly the thing dropped her and turned to confront me, snarling, glaring with its three hideous, bloodshot eyes, waving its thick, bent arms. I had no weapons save those with which nature had endowed me. The regret of that came as a fleeting thought, and then I crashed into the thing. My fist, passing its awkward guard, struck it full in the face. I sickened. Even in the heat of combat, a nausea swept me, for no solid flesh and bone met my blow. Like the shell of an egg, my fist crashed into and through its face. Warm, sticky moisture. A stench. The thing had toppled backward, with me sprawling upon its bloated bulk. It struggled, writhed. Its arms gripped me. Its huge fingers clutched my throat. I caught a glimpse of its smashed face, so close I turned away. A face of yellow-white pulp. My fist cracked and sank into its chest. I pounded, smashed, broke the shell of its distended body. Noisome. The revulsion, the nausea of it all but overcame me. At last the thing lay still, and from the wet, sticky foulness of it I rose and stood shuddering. Elza lay on the ground, but she had risen upon one elbow, and I saw that she was unharmed save for the shock of terror through which she had passed. A mitigated shock, with the knowledge now that I was with her. and that I too was uninjured. The infant thing had vanished. I hastened forward. "Elza! Elza, dear!" Joy lighted her face. "Jac!" I would have lifted her up, but the consciousness of my own foulness, the yellow-white slime streaked with red which smeared my arms, splattered my clothing, gave me pause. In the growing light, beyond the clearing, I caught the silver sheen of water. Without a word I ran for it. A shimmering pool, the existence of which no doubt had drawn these gruesome beings of the forest into its vicinity. To the cleansing water I ran, plunged in, purged myself of that horrible foulness which human senses could not endure. When I returned, Elza was upon her feet. Recovered at last, she flung herself into my arms, impulsive, seeking protection as she clung to me. Fear, the letdown of overwrought nerves as she stood and clung and sobbed upon my shoulder. It was all of that, but oh, it was more than that as well. My Elza, raising her tear-stained face and kissing me, murmuring, "Jac, I love you." Murmuring her love. "Jac, dear, you're safe. I've wanted so long to be with you again. I've been so frightened, so frightened." Giving me back my kisses unreserved, holding me with eager arms. Tarrano? The memory of him came to me. How foolish my fears, my jealousy. That man of genius, conqueror of worlds. But my Elza loved me. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Industriana. It must have been 2 days later when at last we were rescued by the Real Patrol and taken to Industriana. Back there in the forest I had suddenly remembered that the mate to the thing I had killed would doubtless be lurking in the vicinity. We fled, subsisting on what food of the wilds we could find. At last we were picked up and taken to the City of Work. The great city had been destroyed. Wanton capital of the Central State. We learned now that it lay dead. To outward aspect unharmed. Fair, serene, alluring as ever, it lay there on its shimmering waters. But the life within it was dead. Refugees, a quarter perhaps of the inhabitants, had escaped. Hourly the search patrols were picking them up, bringing them to Industriana. Rescue parties were searching the city to find any who might still be alive. And out in the forest lay a great pile of ashes, still exhaling a thin wisp of its deadly breath. Where Tarrano had created the black cloud, lost his captive Elza, but doubtless had escaped himself back to his city of ice. We found Georg and Maida safe at Industriana. Marvelous city. Elza had never seen it before. She sat gazing breathless as from the air on the patrol vessel we approached it. The land of this region was a black, rocky soil upon which vegetation would not grow. A rolling land, grimly black, metallic, with outcroppings of ore, red and white, and with occasional patches of thin white sand whereon a prickly blue grass struggled for life. Rolling hills, and then places where nature had upheaved into a turmoil, huge naked black crags, buttes, hills with precipitous black sides of sleek metal, narrow canyons with tumultuous water flowing through them. In such a place stood Industriana, the City of Work. Set in an area where nature lay scarred, twisted in convulsion, its buildings clung to every conceivable slope and in every position. Many-storied buildings, residences and factories indiscriminately intermingled, all built in sober, solid rectangles of the forbidding black stone. A long steep slope from an excavated quarry deep in the ground ran straight up to a commanding hilltop, the slope set with an orderly array of buildings clinging to it in terraces. Buildings, huge or tiny huts, all anchored in the rear to the ground and set upon metal girders in the front. Bisecting the slope was a vertical street, a broad escalator of moving steps, one half going upward, the other down. Beside it, a series of other escalators for the traffic of moving merchandise. Cross streets on the hill were spider bridges, clinging with thin, stiff legs. And at the summit of the hill stood a tremendous funnel, belching flame and smoke into the sky. To one side of the hill lay a bowl-like depression, with a single squat building in its center, a low building of many funnels, and about it the black yawning mouths of shafts down into the ground, mines, vomiting ore, broken chunks of the metallic rock coming up as though by the invisible magic of magnetism, hunting through the air in an arc to fall with a clatter into great bins above the smelter. In another place, at the bottom of a canyon, roared a surging torrent of river, a harnessed river, plunging into turbines, emerging to tumble over a cascade, its every drop caught by turning buckets spilled again at the bottom. Water pursuing its surging course downward, its power used again and again. The canyon dry at one place near the lower edge of the city. The water, all electrified, resolved into piped hydrogen and oxygen. Like a tremendous clock ticking, the water, momentarily dammed back, was released in a torrent to the electrolysis vats. The hissing gases, under tremendous pressure, raised up the heavy-weighted tops of two expanding tanks. Another tick of this giant clock. The gases released were merged again to water. The tops of the tanks lowered, each in turn, one coming down as the other went up. Hundreds of tons of weight, their slow downward pull geared to scores of whirling wheels. The power shifted to dynamos scattered throughout the city. It was a twilight of nightfall when we arrived over Industriana. 1,000 funnels and chimneys belched their flame and smoke, the flame tinting the sky with a lurid yellow-green glare, the smoke hanging like a dim blue gauze through which everything seemed unreal, infernal. From the city rose a roar, the myriad sounds of industry mingled by the magic of distance. And as we got closer, the roar resolved into its component parts. The grinding of gears, clicking of belts and chains, whirring of dynamos and motors, shrill electrical screams, the clattering of falling ore, clanking of swiftly moving merchandise bound in metal, magnetized to monorail cars, shifting it to warehouses on the nearby hills. And over it all flashed the brilliant signal lights of the merchandise traffic directors, whose stentorian electrical voices broadcasting commands sounded above the city's noises. An inferno of activity, a seeming confusion, yet the aspect of confusion was a fallacy, for beneath it lay a precision, an orderly precision as calm and exact as the mind of the director of a signal tower counting off the split seconds of his beams. An orderly precision, the brain of one man guiding and dominating everything. At his desk alone for long hours throughout the days and nights. A quiet, gray-haired gentleman, unhurried, unharassed, seemingly almost inactive, always seated at his empty desk, smoking endless Arrant cylinders, the dominating business brain of Industriana. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. Departure. Georg and Maida were very busy in Industriana, and now Elsa and I were admitted to their activities. Elsa and I, with our newfound love and happiness neglected for the greater thing, the welfare of the nation upon which hinged the very safety of Venus itself, and Mars, and our own fair Earth. Industriana, greatest commercial and manufacturing center of Venus, had been given over momentarily to the preparations for war. The reals had at last turned from industry to the conquest of Tarrano. Preparations were almost completed. Our armies were to start within a very few times of sleep. I had had no experience in warfare, but the history of our Earth had told me much of it. The enlisting and training of huge armies of men, arming them, artillery, naval and air forces, commissary and supplies, a gigantic business organization to equip, move, and maintain millions of fighting men. Ancient warfare. This, our modern way, was indeed dissimilar. It was from most aspects simplicity itself. We had no need of men in great numbers. I found something like a single 1,000 of men being organized and trained and equipped with weapons, to outward aspects comparatively simple. On all the three worlds, the age of explosives, of the sort history records, was long since past. Electronic weapons, all basically the same. And I found now that it was the power for them, developed, transformed into its various characteristics, and stored for individual transportation and use, which was mainly engrossing Industriana. I had opportunity that first night of meeting Geno Realton, the present head of that famous Realton line, for generations hereditary leaders of their race. We found him, this Geno Realton, in a secluded, somber little office of black metallic walls, gray hangings and rug, a block of carved stone his desk, and a few of the stiff-backed stone chairs, each with its single prim cushion. The office was beyond sight and sound of the busy city. His desk was empty, save for the array of apparatus around its edges. The clicking tabulators which recorded, sorted, analyzed, and summarized for him every minute detail with which the city was engaged. Machines of business detail. We had them, of course, in the inter-allied offices of Greater New York. I have seen our divisional director voice into a mouthpiece the demand for some statistical summary computed up to 5 minutes before, and covering his entire Atlantic division. He would have it, recorded in cold print before him, within a moment. Yet, compared to the Realton efficiency, our own methods seemed antiquated indeed. This man was in touch with every transpiring detail simultaneously, yet not confused by them, for every detail was also combined into a whole, to be examined for itself if he wished. Visually as well, the entire city lay before his gaze. The walls of the office were lined with rows and tiers of small mirrors, receivers, and mouthpieces connected him with everything. Sights, sounds, and even smells of the various factories were available to him. Smells, when his sense of smell might be necessary for the testing of some elusive gas. Without moving his physical body, his presence was in effect transported wherever throughout the city he wished to be. A man of tremendous concentration, to handle but one thing at a time, with all the power of his brain to give instant decision, and then to forget it utterly. I found him a rather small man, smooth shaven, gray-haired, a grave face and demeanor, with dark eyes solemn with thought, yet twinkling often when he spoke. A man of flabby muscles and gentle voice, seemingly unforceful, and with a personality likable but hardly dominating. Instinctively I found myself comparing him to Tarrano. Tarrano's strong, wiry body, the flash of his eye, his inscrutability always suggesting menace, the power, the genius of his personality, the force radiating from him which no one could mistake, his intellectual power, his concentration, certainly the equal of this little leader of the Reals. Tarrano the Conqueror. Tarrano, man of destiny, risen from nothing, and by the sheer genius of his will throwing 3 worlds into chaos. At one stage combining 2 worlds into his self-created empire, and menacing the 3rd. Surely Tarrano was the greater man than this Realton. I knew it. Much as I hated Tarrano, I was forced to admit it. Yet, as I stood there, acknowledging the soft-spoken greeting of Realton, I had the swift premonition that Tarrano was going down into defeat, and that this little man, without moving from his desk or raising his voice, would be the main factor in bringing it about. And I wondered why such a thing could be. I know why now. Tarrano, with all his genius, lacked just one quality which this little man had in abundance: the milk of human kindness, humanity, a radiating force the essence of which, paradoxically, was the unforceful gentleness of him. The Almighty, as we each of us in our hearts must envisage our God, is just, but gentle, humane in his justness, and with all the genius in the universe, the warlike power, the weapons, the cohorts, all the wonderful armament of war. You cannot transgress the will of the Almighty. Against all human logic of what should be victory, you will meet defeat. The thoughts fled through my mind and vanished into the realities of the present. Realton was saying, "We will be ready within another time of sleep. Jac Hallen, you wish, I suppose, to go out with our forces?" "Oh, yes," I said. He smiled. "The eagerness of youth for danger, and yet is very necessary, very laudable." He passed his hand across his forehead with a weary gesture, a gesture which seemed to me despondent. Could this be our vaunted leader? My heart sank. He added abruptly, "We shall conquer this Tarrano, but at what cost?" His smile was wistful. "We must choose the lesser evil." Still gently, almost sorrowfully, but with a directness and clarity of thought which amazed me, he plunged into a detailed account of what Georg was to do in command of our forces. My own part in it, already planned by him in detail. Maida's part, Elza's, the division of Real maidens. Girlhood in war! It seemed very strange. Yet the Real maidens were going as a matter of course, since there were some activities for which they were more fitted than the men. With all the Real maidens going, Elza and Maida would not stay behind. And though Maida, a wife, was objected to by Rhaalton, he had yielded finally to her pleading. I will not now detail our plans or our armament. We had in general 1,000 unmarried men in 5 divisions of 200 each. They were largely Reals, with the few Earthmen previously sent us, 50 perhaps of the most loyal Slaans, and a scattering of the other races of the Venus Central State. A few, 30 perhaps, of the Little People of Mars. In addition, another 100 men, individually in charge of the larger apparatus and the vehicles, and the division of 200 girls. Our journey to the Cold Country was to be made on flying platforms and vehicles of various sizes, some large to carry 50 passengers or more, others so small that only one person could be carried. These latter the girls were to use. I call them platforms. In this size, they were not literally speaking much more than the transporting mechanism fastened to the girl's waist. There were also heavier vehicles carrying the larger apparatus, and several of fairly large size, with food, clothing, housing equipment, supplies of all kinds for our maintenance abroad. A dozen vehicles also carrying huge skeleton towers, encircled at the top with ray projectors. A vehicle with a single room, an instrument room fully equipped, by means of which General Rhaalton at his desk would be in contact with our every move. And largest vehicle of all, in aspect a solid, squat affair, almost of a size for interplanetary travel, our power plant. We started at dawn of the second morning after my own arrival in Industriana. The girls were to travel to the borders of the Cold Country on the larger vehicles, but they wished to start flying individually for the first few helans of the journey for practice. Georg, Maida, Elza, and I were to travel in the instrument room. We massed upon a broad hilltop near the city. In the gray twilight of dawn, with a flush of pink in the sky where the sun in a few moments would rise, I stood in the outer doorway of the instrument vehicle. Around me was the confusion of departure. Eager young men, laughing girls, flushed with excitement. The gaiety of youth going to war. Young as I was myself, I was struck with the drama, the pathos of it. What would the homecoming be? Georg, Maida, and Elza were with me. General Rhaalton stepped up to us, bareheaded, a solemn little man, heavy-hearted. "Goodbye," he said simply. "I know you will do your best." "Chuck, look there!" I followed Elza's startled gesture to the soft white clouds which were massed in the sky above us. By what magic of science the thing was accomplished I know not, but up there in the clouds a gigantic image of Tarrano was materializing, his head and shoulders, arms folded, his face with a sardonic smile leering down at us, lips moving, and out of the air about us came his audible, broadcasting words. "Do your best, my friends." Ironic mockery. "Coming to conquer Tarrano? Hasten. You are keeping Tarrano waiting most impatiently." The giant voice died away into silence. The huge image melted into the clouds and vanished. Rhaalton looked at us again, expressionless. "Goodbye," he repeated. "Do your best." He turned away abruptly. and then as he walked with a despondent droop, I saw his shoulders suddenly straighten. He flung a hand into the air, the signal to start. From a tower in Industriana, a puff of violet light shot up to magnify the signal. The girls, all in their places, rose into the air, draperies fluttering. Like graceful birds they rose, circled over us in an arc, and then in a long single line, with officers apart to one side, marking them in squads of 20, they sped into the dimness of distance. The tower vehicles now were rising. Then the larger platform, the power plant, like a floating building, sailing majestically up. "Come, Jack." Elza and Maida were inside the instrument room, gazing through one of its windows, and Georg drew me within, closing the transparent door after us. Through the windows I could see the line of vehicles following after the girls. Then our instrument room rose quietly, soundlessly. The ground dropped slowly away, then faster, and as we swung about, I saw the hilltop beneath us. Its sides were lined with waving spectators. Stricken momentarily with awe at the apparition of Tarrano, they had already forgotten it. From every vantage point of Industriana, they were frantically waving. But the hilltop was empty, save for one lone figure, Geno Realton, standing sorrowfully, gazing after us. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. First assault. Our spies had informed us that of recent weeks there had arisen about the city of Ice a huge wall behind which Tarrano would make his stand. It was our plan to approach within range of this and establish our power plant as a base from which to direct our offensive. The trip from the great city was not long. After a few helans, our girls ceased flying individually and boarded their appointed vehicles. In a long single line, armament platforms, the towers, our instrument room, with the power plant bringing up the rear, we sailed forward. There were in our instrument vehicle Maida, Georg, Elza, and myself. The vehicle manned by 2 pilots and 2 mechanicians, a Slayan, a Marsman, and 2 Earthmen. We were in constant communication with Geno Realton, and though he enjoined upon us all the necessity for sleeping or resting during the trip, himself sat alert at his desk, unrelaxing. The little mirror on our table showed him sitting there, watching every move we made. We laid down to rest, but sleep was impossible. Through the paneled transparent floor, I watched the country changing as we advanced. Vegetation dwindling, the soil changing to rocky barrenness at the border of the cold country, and then the snow plains, the mute, frozen rivers of ice, the mountains. In the twilight of the cold country autumn, we sailed up to the mountains and approached to the city of ice. Alert, all of us now, as at an altitude of a few thousand feet, we circled about, marking time until the power plant had selected its base and landed to make ready for the battle. Throughout the trip we had expected, had anticipated the possibility of a surprise attack by Tarrano, an ambush in the open air, perhaps, by some means strange to us. But the vision magnifiers, the microphones, encompassing every known range of sight and sound, showed us nothing. Especially at the mountains we had thought to meet opposition, but at first none came. It seemed somehow ominous, this lack of action from Tarrano. And when the leader of our line, a tower vehicle, rose sharply to scale the jagged peaks of the divide, The flare of a hostile electronic bomb rising came almost as a relief. From the instrument room, forewarned an instant by the hiss of our microphones, I saw the bomb start upward. Slowly as a rocket it mounted, a blurred ball of glowing violet light, quite plain in the dim twilight. I knew that the tower platform at which it was directed would have time to throw out its insulation. I knew that the insulation would doubtless be effective, yet my heart leaped nevertheless. At my hand was a projector, but in those few seconds, the tower just in advance of us in the line was quicker. Its ray darted at the violet ball. The soundless explosion threw a wave of sparks about the menace tower. Like a puff, a pricked bubble of soap film, the violet ball was dissipated. But I saw the menace tower rock a trifle from the shock. General Rialton's face in the mirror beside me was very solemn. I heard him murmuring something to the other towers, saw their light flash downward, searching the mountain defiles. And as I watched that little image of Rialton, I chanced to notice a mirror on Rialton's desk. Rialton himself was looking at it, a mirror which had been dark, but which now flashed on. An outlaw circuit. The mirror imaged the face of Tarrano. Tarrano grinning ironically. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Invisible Assailants. We did not locate the source of the bomb, and no others arose to assail us. The mountain defiles, so far as our lights could illuminate them, seemed deserted. We passed over the divide, and on the plateau beyond we landed, a region of rolling country beneath its snow and ice. The mountains came down sharply to the inner plain, a crescent of mountain range stretching off to the dimness of distance, half encircling this white plateau in the center of which stood the city of ice. We could just see it at the horizon, the glittering spires of its ice palace. Around the city, completely enveloping it, was a thick circular wall of ice 20 times the height of a man. We were too far away to see it plainly. A turreted wall, doubtless armed with projectors throughout its circular length. Our finders would not show it, for it was insulated against them. It stood there gray-white, bleak, and apparently deserted. Georg said, "It's the man's accursed inactivity. Is he going to do nothing? Our power plant has landed, Jack. There in the foothills. See it drop?" A call from Rialton took his attention. We landed our entire force in the foothills of the mountains. The power plant was there. It looked like a squat industrial building set upon a ledge of ice. A shining cliff face behind it, a precipice in front. At the foot of the precipice, our other vehicles were clustered. We were there throughout 3 entire times of sleep, hours strangely the same in that unaltered polar twilight. During them, with the tower platforms set in a ring about us to make an armed camp, we unloaded our apparatus, erected our power controls, prepared the individual circuits, making ready for our offensive. And still, though we were alert for it, no move from Tarrano. They were hours during which, with my lack of technical knowledge, I found myself often with nothing to do. Our camp was bustling with activity, but among the now idle girls and many of the young men, there was an air of gaiety. They laughed, shouted, played games amid the rocks from which we had long since melted the snow. Once, in what would have been early evening had not the sun in these latitudes held level like a burned-out ball near the horizon, Elsa and I, wandered from the camp to climb the cliffs nearby. Beyond the circle of the camp's heat, the deadly cold of the region assailed us. We had not wished to equip with the individual heating, which for battle would leave us free of heavy garments. Instead, we swathed ourselves in furs, with the exercise of climbing to aid us in keeping warm. It was wonderful to be again alone with Elza. Even with what was impending, we were young enough to put it momentarily from our minds. Like young lovers clandestinely stealing away to a tryst, we left the camp and hand in hand climbed up amid the crags. A few 100 feet to one side of the powerhouse, and about the same distance above it, we sat down at last to rest. The scene from here was picturesque in the extreme. Across the flat, shadowless, snowy plain was the wall of ice, with the city behind it. All in the far distance, this city wherein our enemy was entrenched. And there were no lights, no movement that we could see. In that drab twilight, it seemed almost unreal. The plain, too, was empty. A few palpably deserted huts. Nothing else. Beneath us, snugly anchored there on the ledge, was our powerhouse. No unreality here. Its aerials were mounted, its external dynamos were visibly revolving. From its windows blue shafts of light slanted out, and from it rose the low hum of active power. Below it, spread over the slightly sloping area of foothill beneath us, lay our encampment. A ring of our tower vehicles, with their projectors mounted and ready, their colored search beams slowly sweeping the white plain and the dead gray sky. Within their ring, the camp itself, lighted by the blue-white tubes set upon quadrupeds at intervals, heated by strings of red glowing wire and the red wire balls used on Venus. The snow and ice on the ground within the camp had melted, exposing the naked rock. A scene of blue and red lights and shifting shadows, bustling with activity. Figures, tiny from this height, hurrying about. The sounds from it rose to us. The low hum and snap of the weapons being tested, the shouted commands, and sometimes mingled with it the laughing shout of a light-hearted girl. Elza clung close to me. "Everything will be ready soon." I nodded. "They're going to mount a ray up here on the cliff," Grolier was telling me, "for permanent protection. To stay here with the powerhouse when we go out to the attack." Silent with her thoughts, she did not answer me. Sidewise, I regarded her solemn little face encased in its hood of fur. And then clumsily, for our furs were heavy and awkward, I put my arm about her. "I love you, Elza. It's worth a great deal to be here alone with you." "Jack, what will he do?" Her gaze was to the far-off city of ice. "It seems so sinister, Jack. This silence from him. This inactivity. It is not like him to be inactive." "He's there," I said. "Roltar, the Marsman, boastful fellow, blowhard. He was telling some of us that in his opinion Tarrano had already run away." "Never!" she exclaimed. "This is his last stand. He'll make it here. Defeat us here." "Elza!" She glanced momentarily at me, smiled a queer smile, and then gazed once more over the distant plain. "I do not mean I think he'll defeat us, Jack. I mean that is his reasoning. Make his last stand here." "He hasn't run away," I repeated. "I told Roltar so. We got an outlaw connection into the Ice Palace today. For a moment only, and then it was discovered and broken off. But we had the image for a moment. It chanced to show Tarrano himself. But he's isolated now. Breton said his isolation power, around the ice palace and the wall anyway, is greater than any image ray we can send against it. My heart leaped suddenly, for I saw Elsa's eyes widen, fear spring to her face, heard the sharp intake of her breath, and felt her hand grip my arm. "Jack, there's something wrong. See there? And you hear it?" From the instrument room I heard a vague drumming, a hiss, and then a drumming growing louder. It was not a new sound, for now I remembered I had been conscious of it for several moments past. Our encampment was awake to it. A confusion down there, people running about, a figure dashing wildly into the instrument room, and the aerials on the powerhouse began to snap viciously. "Jack, what is it?" "I don't know. See there, Elsa? The sub-ray lights." The search beams from our towers were inordinately active, sweeping the empty snow plain and the empty sky. Empty? To my fevered imagination, they were peopled with enemies. And then one of the towers flashed on a sub-ray, the dull infrared for envisaging the slow rays below the power of human sight. And another tower with its faint purple beam was using the ultraviolet. "That drumming, Elsa! That's a microphone! The big one they just erected near the instrument room. There's something coming. That's the magnified sound of some distant rush of air. Very faint sound, but they must have heard it on the earphones long ago. That microphone must have just been connected. Something coming? We could see nothing. Let's go down, Jack. We must get back. I've got infrared glasses." I fumbled beneath my furs, but I did not have them. "Jack, wait, Elsa." My glasses would have been useless, for the sub and ultra beams from the towers were disclosing nothing. I could tell that by the hasty searching sweeps they made. And then from the big Wilton Tower, the newly connected Z-ray flashed on. I could hear the load of it in the deepened, throaty hum from the powerhouse. Its dirty brown beam sprayed out over the plain, then swung to the sky, caught something, hung motionless, narrowed into great intensity. The powerful Z-ray capturing the visibility of dense solids only. Footnote 24. Similar, doubtless, to our present-day X-ray. There was something up there in the sky. The Z-ray met resistance. We could see the sparks and hear the snap of them coming like a roar from the microphone above the drumming. Met the resistance and conquered it. Gradually, the snapping roar died away. "Jack, I see something. Something there. Don't you see it?" A luminous blur became visible in the nearer sky. Moving blobs of silver luminosity in the mud-brown light of the Z-ray. 100 or more moving silver blobs. They were taking form. The silvery phosphorescent look faded, became gray-white, took definite shape. Waving arms and legs. Bones bereft of flesh. Human skeletons. Limbs waving rhythmically. Bony arms with fingers clutching metal weapons. Assailants coming at us through the air, stripped by the Z-ray of clothing. Skin, flesh, organs to the naked bone. Skeletons with skulls of empty eye sockets and set jaw bones to make the travesty of human faces grim with menace. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Attack on the powerhouse. Stricken with surprise and awe, Elsa and I sat there motionless. Our encampment was in a turmoil of confusion, chaos, out of which very soon order came. The skeleton figures in the air. I saw now that there were nearer 200 than 100, were perhaps 2,000 feet away, and at an altitude of about the cliff ledge where Elsa and I were sitting. They swept forward, bathed in the Z-ray with all our other search beams darkened to give it full sway. Momentarily I saw them clearer, metallic cylinders in bony figures, and a metal mechanism of flight encasing, yet not touching the ribs. "Jack, why don't our rays?" As though to answer Elza's unfinished question, one of our towers turned a disintegrating ray upon them. A narrow pencil point of light, barely visible in this flat daylight. It swung up into our Z-ray, searched and clung to one of the skeleton figures. Had it penetrated, the man would have been dissipated like a puff of vapor, but it did not. And then I knew that for that distance at least, this enemy's isolation power, individual barrage, was too great. Yet the assailed figure wavered. Our amplifier gave out his shout, half fear, half admonition. The line of skeletons swung upward, came on, but mounted so that I saw that they were making for the summit of the cliff above us, above our powerhouse. Their defense, invisibility, and a mere isolation barrage so that we could not harm them with our tower rays while they kept beyond range. But what was their means of attack? Why would Tarrano... "The powerhouse," Elza answered, and I realized then that she had read my thoughts. The powerhouse. If they could demolish it... Our thoughts, questions and answers unspoken, flew fast, but the drama before us unfolded faster. With the knowledge that we could see them, these invaders cast aside a portion of their equipment to give them greater freedom. We could see the metal portions of the trappings falling like plummets. The skeleton images faded, and then as our tower withdrew the Z-ray and our search beams picked them up, we saw our enemies as they really were. Men clothed in a casing of cylindrical garments with the flying mechanism strapped to their chests. Some with visors and headpieces. Nearly all with small weapons in their hands. Keeping well away, they continued to mount. They were striving for the pinnacle of cliff tops above us. But as our rays darted at them, they halted, wavered, and now, when nearly above the camp, they began mounting straight up. "Jack, look there!" One of our tower vehicles was preparing to rise. Its ray, following the search beams upward, was aimed at the invaders, but they were beyond its effective range. Their weapons of attack? I knew now. Suicides! Whether Elza said it or merely thought it, I do not know. One of the figures came down as though falling. A few seconds only, but though our search beam showed it, the smaller rays for those seconds missed it. Down, until no more than 500 feet above us, it checked its fall. A giant of a man, and with his hand cylinder in range now, he shot a bolt at our powerhouse. It struck. I could see the flash, saw an aerial shatter before the charge went harmlessly into the body of the building. Then one of our rays caught the man. His figure crumpled. The shower of sparks as his barrage was broken exploded like a tiny bursting bomb. And as the sparks died, there was nothing where the man had been. A suicide. But one of our aerials was shattered. And then others came down. Not many, for it was a grim business, and the courage of them must have failed at the last. Falling bodies. Tiny bolts striking the powerhouse. The sparks. Then empty air where living men had been. Our tower left the ground. Some of our men, with small flying platforms strapped to them, were crowding its top. Its beams preceded it, but I saw the beams breaking intermittently as the bolts struck the powerhouse. The invaders wavered with indecision. Some of them came down to voluntary death. Others strove for the cliff top. Some took flight. Our tower swept into them. One of them, injured but not annihilated, fell with a crash into the encampment. Above Elsa and me was a maze of flashing beams, futile bolts, the puffs of myriad sparks. A bolt seemed to strike quite near where we were sitting. I drew Elsa back and we crouched in the hollow of a rock. A body came hurtling down, crashed to the cliff ledge almost at our feet, with the sickening thump of mangled flesh and broken bones. Hung an instant to give me a momentary glimpse of a face contorted in death agony, then rolled over and fell further down the jagged cliff. Then above us presently there was silence and the drab, empty sky. Our tower was back beyond the cliff top. Soon it appeared. Apparently unharmed, it came dropping down to its former place on the ground. The first attack was over, and off in the distance a few solitary figures were winging their way back to the City of Ice. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. City of Ice Besieged. We were not greatly harmed by this surprise attack. The powerhouse was superficially damaged, but soon repaired. That night, I call it that, though the constant weak daylight made the term incongruous, activity showed in the City of Ice. It came with a vertical spray of light rising from the ice wall which encircled the city, spreading light beams rising from points 100 feet apart along the wall. The beams spread fan-shape, so that within 50 feet above their source, they met and merged into a thin sheet of effulgence rising into the sky. Tarrano's barrage. It seemed then that beyond suicidal sorties of the kind we had just repulsed, Tarrano was planning to stand purely on the defensive. It was our own plan to surround the city with our towers. Even those on the further side would be within range of our powerhouse, and with the city thus beleaguered, we would attack the wall from every side at once. We tested now this barrage Tarrano had thrown up. Sprays of its insulated area came down to protect the wall in front, and protected also the triangular spaces between the sources of the main beams. Tentatively, one of our towers approached within range, but our rays only beat into the barrage with the hiss of molten metal plunged into water, and with a burst of interference sparks. Even at a horizontal 1,000 feet we could do nothing. Then we tried altitude. Our projectors, mounted individually on small platforms, automatically controlled to fly without human pilot, went up, and we strove to get them over the barrage. At 5,000 feet, one went over safely, but the electronic bomb it dropped into the city was an easy mark for Tarrano's watchful defense rays. He exploded it harmlessly when it was still high above him. After the next time of sleep, we invested the city. Our towers were set in a ring about it, 2,000 feet from the wall. They were mobile units, ready to sail forward or back or upward at any moment. Georg stayed in command of the instrument room. It was never placed, but sailed continuously in slow circular flight around the city above our line. The powerhouse remained in its place, with our largest projector mounted on the cliff beside it in order to frustrate any further attacks. They were solemn moments as we broke our encampment. The girls, far more agile in the air than men, were lightly dressed, with the supporting mechanism strapped to them. The heating units enveloped them in an invisible cloak of warm air. To their left arms, a strapped cylinder gave off a fan-shaped area of insulation, an almost invisible shield of protective barrage some 5 feet long. It showed as a faint glow of light, and in flight their left arms could swing it like a shield to protect their bodies. They had telephonic earpieces available, a tiny mirror fastened to their chests to face them, upon which Georg or General Rialton could project images, a mouthpiece for talking to Georg, and a belt of offensive weapons useful within a range of 500 feet, but no further. Very alert and agile, twisting and turning in the air were these girls. We men were similarly equipped, but our movements in the air were heavier, clumsier. Elza and I had practiced with the others for days, and with our harmless dueling rays I had found that I could never hope to hit her while she dealt me mortal blows. Elza, commanding a squad of 20 girls, was assigned to a portion of the line some helans from me. My own place, with 100 men under me, was near a tower almost on the opposite side from the powerhouse. It was a solemn parting from Elza. I wrapped her in my arms, tried to smile. "Be very careful, Elza." She kissed me, clung to me, then cast me off and was gone. With the city invested, we rested idly for another time of sleep. Occasionally we made a tentative tower attack, which came to nothing. Tarrano waited. His barrage remained the same. We tried to provoke a move from him, but could not. The snow plain where I was stationed here was similar to the other side, save that there were no mountains. From the powerhouse to Tarrano's wall there was a dip, so that the wall stood upon higher ground. On my side, however, the reverse was true. The wall lay in a hollow in one place, with a steady upward slope back from it to uplands behind us, as though in some better day a broad watercourse had flowed down here, now long since buried in the solid ice and snow. I mention this topography because it had a vital bearing upon what so soon was to transpire. Rialton desired that Tarrano come out and attack us, but Tarrano would not. We thought perhaps that his offense was inadequate, and the one move that he made strengthened that belief. From the city beside the palace, a rectangle of black metal some 50 feet square rose slowly up. In aspect it was a square, windowless room, a room without a ceiling, open at the top. It rose to a height of 500 feet and hung level, and from it depended dangling power cables connecting it with the ground. It was the presence of these cables that made us feel Tarrano was offensively weak. He could not aerially transport his power, hence, for offense he could only rely upon individual batteries which, unless permanently stationed within the city, we knew would have a short range at best. We watched this thing in the air for hours. It did not move. It was soundless. What was its purpose? We could not guess. And then, at last, General Rialton ordered us all to the attack. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Battle. I found myself in the air. With my men around me we hovered. Then Georg's command from the instrument room sounded in my ears. I gave the signal, and flying wedge-shaped, we hurled ourselves forward. It was like lying on the air, diving head foremost. The rush of wind sang past me. The ground, 100 feet below, was a white surface flowing backward. We were heading for the base of one of Tarrano's barrage projectors. It was mounted within the wall, but the wall itself was protected merely by a fan-shaped subsidiary beam, A weaker barrage over that small area which by concentrated effort we hoped to break. From a helon away on both sides of me, I saw other wedges of our men coming slanting in to assail the same point. Overhead, a corps of girls was hovering. Our towers, 3 of them concentrated here, had risen to a moderate height. Their rays were playing upon the threatened area. A steady fountain of sparks showed where they were striking the barrage. A silent bombardment of flashing beams and sparks. At 500 feet, we added our own smaller rays to the turmoil. If the barrage would break at this point. The instrument room, watchful of everything, sailed over me. On my mirror, I saw Georg's intent face. His voice said, "Careful, Jack. They may come out." Prophetic words. The segment of barrage here suddenly vanished. A ray darted out. Beside it, a cloud of flying figures came out of the city like insects from a hive. An inferno of almost hand-to-hand fighting. It was everyone for himself. And I gave the order for my men to break formation, ordered them to get up close to the wall if they could, to strike with the closest possible range at the base of the enemy ray. I flung myself forward. Tarrano's men soon were around me. Twisting, darting figures, tiny beams of death to be fended off with my shield. A body fell past me in the air. Others, while I looked at them, in the blink of an eyelid vanished into nothingness. One of our towers, sailing high, suddenly went dark, turned over, wavered down, dismembered with leprous, missing parts, and then in a puff was obliterated. I found myself nearly up to the wall, and higher than its top. The segment of barrage remained broken. I could see into the city, the ice palace, still seemingly deserted, and near it, the base of the powerful ground ray which was assailing our towers. If I could get past the wall unnoticed, get within range of that projector. Most of the fighting was now behind me. We seemed to be holding our own. The squad of girls was coming down. I prayed that Elza might not be among them. The instrument room had vanished beyond my sight, but Georg's voice said, "We're sending reinforcements. Gather your men. Hold off for a moment." From every pan of our line, other units of men and towers were coming. We had broken through the barrage here. If we could now, by a concerted rush, get our force over the wall into the city. Within the instrument room, Georg sat watching. The inactivity of his own part, the comparative lack of personal danger galled him. But he was too occupied with his duties to give it more than a passing thought. We had broken the barrage at one point. From every quarter he was rushing reinforcements there to take advantage of the break. And then Tarrano's trickery became apparent. We had not broken his barrage. He had deliberately withdrawn it to encourage us to bring our other units to the spot. Our powerhouse, neglected, was momentarily, comparatively defenseless. The enemy barrage at the point of the wall nearest it suddenly lifted. Beams darted from the opening. Men came out in a cloud. I held back momentarily from the wall and gathered my remnant of men about me. Only half my former strength. But with sinking heart I tried to assure myself that the others had not heeded my call. The fighting here had slackened. Tarrano's men had risen high, engaged at long range by our girls, from whom they were slowly, trickily retreating, as though to lure the girls above the city. And my heart was thankful when I heard the relayed order from Rialton for the girls to withdraw, not to pass above the wall, even at high altitude. The order came just in time. The barrage here flashed on again, trapping a few of our men behind it. I was aware of this new attack on the powerhouse. Our units were hurriedly being ordered back. Georg, in desperation, had flung his instrument vehicle at the enemy ray. My connection broke. And then another connection brought me someone's voice, with the report that the instrument room had darkened that main enemy ray, but had itself crashed to the ground. I wondered if Georg were killed. Later I heard someone say that he was safe within the powerhouse. I disobeyed my final orders. I did not swing back toward the powerhouse. Instead, with my men around me, we fled back from this segment of the wall to the higher lying white plain behind it. I have spoken of the downgrade of this land here, culminating in the depression which marked this part of the wall. It was that depression which gave me my idea. Our heat ray cylinders had so far been useless. They had a range of only 200 feet and no power to attack a barrage. Some of them had futilely been used. The snow and ice on the ground above our recent fighting was melted in patches. Pools of boiling water lay on the naked rock, and the water flowing down the depression had reached the ice wall. A tiny stream of it eating into the wall slowly, surely. With my men, I flew up the slope. The ice and snow here melted under the close range play of our heat cylinders. Rivulets of boiling water began creeping toward the city. Other men at my call joined us. 200 of us soon were melting the ice. The rivulets merged into brooks, to streams, and soon a river, torrent of hissing, boiling water gathering volume as it went, was surging at the wall. The wall began melting, itself feeding this monster which was eating at its vitals. A yawning hole began opening at the base of the wall. It began sagging at the top, crumbling. The segment of barrage here went dark. No trickery now. The barrage at this point actually was broken. The boiling river went through the wall, swept down the slope into the city. Through the great clouds of steam, I could see the ice palace with its brittle outlines softening under the heat. One of its thin spires broke off and fell. Feverishly, we added to the river source. The whole area here was gray with steam. Girls had joined us. Elza was not among them. Elza. With my triumph, there lay always in the background of my consciousness the weight of my fear for Elza. The fighting in the other sector had continued desperately. Our powerhouse was hopelessly damaged. The towers, with their power gone, were using their batteries. Soon they would be exhausted. But now we abandoned that sector. Our remaining towers, all our flying forces, came to this melting area where the vanishing city lay defenseless before us. We hurled ourselves into it, using only our heat rays. Everywhere we added to the boiling torrent. Even the interference heat of the fighting was to our advantage. This brittle city, which owed its very existence to the congealing cold, lay enveloped in a cloud of steam. Then Tarrano played his last card. The cubical building of metal, with the cables depending from it, still hung motionless. It now burst into sound. A low electrical hum, then louder to a whine, a scream. Our men and girls were in the air around it. I too was there. Tarrano's men, the remaining few who were desperately fighting, had suddenly withdrawn. And then we knew the purpose of this hanging room. A strange form of some tremendous electromagnet. I could feel it pulling at me. My power to guide myself in the air was wavering. From my height, I could see down into this ceilingless rectangle. It was unmanned by humans. A room of whirling, flashing knives. Above it, even then, some of our men were struggling in its magnetic grip, being drawn down into it. A girl's power must suddenly have collapsed. She was sucked in with a rush, torn to fragments by the whirling knives. The area of magnetism seemed to spread for a helon or more. Everywhere around me, I saw our men and girls struggling with it, fighting to keep away, but closing in a ring around it, faster, continually more helpless, until at last, their bodies out of control, whirling end over end, they were sucked in like water rushing into a turbine. One of our weakened towers attacked it, but some of the remnants of Tarrano's projectors caught the tower and darkened it. Through the rising clouds of steam, I could see the magnet vaguely now, but I could feel it pulling, and soon, in spite of myself, I was fairly close above it. I strove to keep my wits. The others, who were meeting their death, lost control of their bodies at the last and could not use their cylinders. I had some battery power remaining. I snapped on my disintegrating ray to test it. It was my last desperate recourse. I righted my body, and yielding to the magnetic pull, ceasing to struggle, I dove head first at that yawning rectangle. A gleaming blur of knives, bloodstained now, within these rectangular walls. Horrible carnage. A second of despair. But my ray struck true. Around me was chaos. My senses reeled, went black for an instant. But I recovered, found myself whirling in the empty air. The city was melting into a turmoil of boiling water and surging steam. The fighting everywhere had ceased. Wavering figures were rising, fugitives struggling away. With my senses still confused, I righted myself, undecided where to go or what to do. Above me, two figures were still in combat. One of them, a man, assailed by a heat ray, came hurtling down past me. The other wavered. A girl, with her flying mechanism out of control. She was 100 feet or more above me, wavering downward. Elza! I shot myself up to her, seized her in my arms, my own supporting mechanism sustaining us both. Elza spent, but uninjured. I held her close. Elza, dear! My Elza! We hung there in the air. From out the vanishing city, rising through the steam, came a small metal vehicle. A pointed cylinder, in height no more than twice that of a man. It came up slowly. Its rectangular door was open. As it reached our level and went past us quite close, I saw a man's figure standing there. Tarrano! Tarrano, alone! From the wreckage of his city, making his escape alone. Without thought, holding Elza tightly within my arms, I flung us upward. Tarrano saw us, recognized us. He slackened his upward pace. With my sober reason gone, I strove to overtake him. Saw the sardonic leer on his face, but did not realize that he was waiting for us. We caught up with his vehicle. He pulled us through the doorway to the floor of the narrow circular room with its heavy translucent panes. He was bending over me, leering. Jack Hallen, and my little lady Elza. How fortunate! I cast off Elza, gained my feet. For an instant we stood, Tarrano and I, measuring each other. He seemed calm. His face bore a slow, sardonic smile. He was unarmed, drawn back against the concavity of the wall, watching me with his steady, keen eyes. Behind him, through the low window, I saw the white ground now far below us. We were rising swiftly. "So you brought my Lady Elza back to me, Jack Allen?" He got no further, for with a leap I was upon him. To use my weapons in these narrow quarters would have been suicide. My body pinned him against the wall as I lunged. My fingers strove for his throat. He was no larger than I, but the strength of him was extraordinary. His body stiffened to resist my impact. One of his hands gripped my wrist. His other hand, the heel of it, came up beneath my chin, forcing my head back. He fought silently, with movements that seemed almost deliberate. Into the center of the room we struggled. I saw that Elza was upon her feet, a hand pressed to her mouth in terror. "Elza!" I had meant to tell her to use the control levers which were on a small table nearby, to bring us back to the ground. But with this momentary diverting of my attention, Tarrano's fist struck me full in the face. I staggered back. Elza screamed, called something to Tarrano. I staggered, but I did not fall. And as Tarrano stood there, still with his slow smile, I recovered myself and was again upon him. Locked together, we swayed to the control table. My back was to it. Tarrano's slender fingers, with a grip like alemite, had found my throat. Slowly, irresistibly, he forced me backward over the table. I was helpless. My breath was stopped. Tarrano's triumphant face bending over me was fading with my senses. "In just a moment, Lady Elza." He was telling her calmly that in a moment he would be finished with me. Did the man's egotism, here at the last, delude him into the belief that Elza wanted him to conquer me? With all the weapons of science discarded, this primitive struggle of man against man with a woman as prize, did the thought of that delude him into the belief that her love was his, now that he was killing me? I never knew. But beneath the roaring of my head, I heard his gentle words to her. And then, behind him, I saw her coming forward. A heavy metal object which she had picked up from the floor was in her hand. Tarrano saw her also, in a mirror on the table. Saw her raise the jagged weapon. Raise it to strike, not at me, at himself. His face was close above mine. In that second, I saw in his expression the realization that Elza was attacking him. Whatever his emotions, like a flash he acted. His grip on my throat loosened. His arm, swinging backward, warded off Elza's trembling, hesitant blow. The metal block, intended for his head, was knocked from her hand. It fell clattering to the floor, and reaching over, Tarrano gripped the vehicle's control lever, wrenched it bodily from its fastenings. Control of the vehicle was irrevocably lost. We were falling. Breathless moments. Tarrano idly stood apart, his face a mask. My breath restored, I was recovering. I drew myself erect. Death! But my confused thoughts went to Elza. Her flying mechanism was partially sustaining. My own probably was still effective. Before Tarrano was aware of my purpose, I had pushed Elza forcibly through the doorway. Into the rush of air her figure disappeared. But Tarrano gripped me as I tried to follow her. Gripped me and clung. A breathless, dizzy instant. Locked together, our bodies shifted crazily. I tried to get him out of the doorway with me, but he fought against it. Smiling. Always smiling. Elza fell safely. But they told me that Tarrano and I hovered for days unconscious on the borderland between life and death, living finally, for our vehicle had plunged into a tremendous snowbank to break its fall. Last scene of all, they would not have Tarrano on any of the 3 worlds. While still living, the very personality of him was a menace. With his woman, Tara, who refused to leave him, and whom he tolerated, they banished him to that tiny asteroid which pursued its solitary way between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. A lonely, barren little world, with its single primitive race of spindly beings, timid, frail beings, half human, half insect. We took him there, Maida and Georg, Elza and I. He anticipated his dislike of the asteroid's slight gravity, and demanded weighted shoes, so that he might walk with the normal feeling of Earth and Venus. "You give me too much freedom," he told us solemnly. And there amid the rocks, with Tara, we set him down. As we parted, he turned to Elza. She and I were joined in marriage by then. He faced her, took one of her hands, and pressed its palm to his forehead, the gesture of homage and respect. "Goodbye, Lady Elza. I wish for you all life's happiness." He smiled, but it was a very wistful smile. And then he swung away abruptly. "Tara, prepare me food. Leave me. I would be alone." His imperious gesture dispersed also the crowd of natives who were curiously regarding him. Here, in his last little domain, he would still be master. Our vehicle slowly rose. From its windows we watched him, ignoring us utterly. Weighted down by his heavy shoes, he paced his barren rocks, head lowered, alone with those thoughts he never shared with anyone. Tarrano the Conqueror. End of chapter 37. End of Tarrano the Conqueror by Ray Cummings.